The 1999 Monster Jam World Finals took place on April 3, 1999 at the TWA Dome in St. Louis, Missouri, featuring a star-studded lineup of 16 monster trucks, most of whom have been featured heavily on that season of the Motor Madness TV show. Iconic names such as Gravedigger, Bulldozer, Monster Patrol, Barefoot, Carolina Crusher, Equalizer, Executioner, and Samson would do battle on the toughest track of the season for the richest prize. Barefoot would win the racing competition against Carolina Crusher, and Gravedigger would win the overall points championship that season. Often considered by fans to be the end of an era for Monster Jam, this was the last televised event to not feature a freestyle competition, the last Monster Jam World Finals before moving to Las Vegas, and it showcased almost all of the most popular names on the USHRA circuit at that time, all competing in one event. However, the 2000 USHRA season would see the absence of nearly half of this field from television, despite still running on the same circuit as before. Samson, Monster Patrol, Carolina Crusher, Equalizer, Executioner, and Barefoot were featured often during the 1999 Motor Madness season, but most of them wouldn't reappear at a televised Monster Jam event until over a decade later. Why was this? Why did a massive chunk of Monster Jam's heaviest hitters all of a sudden disappear from their television program in almost all forms of media all at once? And what do they have in common with one another? That's a question I hope to answer in this video. Due to the onset of Monster Jam's company-owned trucks in the years 1999 and 2000, some have theorized that the company pushed some of these bigger independent names to the side for the sake of making their own trucks look better on television, having the company trucks go up against trucks they could much more easily beat, essentially stacking the TV lineups in their favor. It's worth noting that Monster Jam would choose which events the TV cameras would appear at, rather than deciding on a whim which shows to televise after they had already taken place. This is so their hosts and correspondents could film in-person interviews and make the show look like more of a live sporting event or a stylized production. Video cameras would be at every event filming each show, but there was a noticeable difference between USHRA's live event archival footage and the official TV footage done by TNN at the time, although they would often use both footage. Monster Jam would also choose which trucks appeared at which events, which is obvious, and would make sure to load up their televised events with as much star power as they could, as well as making sure there would always be a Gravedigger truck featured on television. To a more cynical fan, this theory would make a lot of sense, as you would want your flagship trucks to be the most successful in order to generate the most fans and to generate the most money. However, this begs the question as to why the King Crunch and Gunslinger trucks are kept around, for instance. While at the time, King Crunch wasn't always a shoo-in for winning events, but Gunslinger was, and had done so on television in 1999. Not to mention, Scott Hartsock was the #1 threat to Tom Mintz and Goldberg for the 2000 winter season, facing off against him in 3 different championship races and defeating him in 1. If anything, Monster Jam would want Hartsock to be gone from television as well, since he didn't own any part of his truck and he proved he could beat theirs. The same goes for King Crunch, who beat Gravedigger at World Finals 1. Besides, Monster Jam's fleet of trucks in the early 2000s wasn't nearly as big and strong as it is now, with only a dozen to their name in the year 2000, so they needed these well-known independent trucks to attract fans, fill out their lineups, and be a part of their merchandising. Monster Patrol was also one of these trucks, and was one of the most popular trucks on the USHRA circuit by the year 2000, with it being a frequent rival of Gravediggers for many years prior, so it would seem very counterproductive to remove one of your most popular trucks from both merchandising and television, especially since it still competed on the same circuit during that time. With all that being said, the biggest piece of evidence as to why this theory is unlikely to be true is the main subject of this video. In late 1999, Monster Jam would work out merchandising deals for multiple independent monster truck teams that had been competing frequently on the USHRA circuit. This included the likes of Reptoid, King Crunch, Gunslinger, Bustin' Loose, Sudden Impact, Predator and Prowler, Mountaineer, Destroyer, and Avenger, among others. While perhaps not all at once, these trucks and multiple others would be featured heavily not only on Monster Jam's televised shows, but in all forms of merchandising, such as t-shirts, Hot Wheels toys, hats, sticker books, home videos, video games, keychains, and even homework folders and textbook covers. These independent trucks were an integral part of Monster Jam's memorabilia at the time. At around the same time, a separate company called Milestone Motorsports would sign multiple other independent teams to promotional and merchandising deals as well. including teams such as all of Paul Shafer Motorsports except Wild Thing, Samson, Equalizer, Maniac, Executioner, Virginia Giant, and Bigfoot, among others. Of course, Bigfoot and Monster Jam had parted ways before this, so we won't be referring to their relationship during this video. To give you a bit of backstory, Milestone Motorsports marketing was formed in October of 1997 and existed as a means of being an independent marketing firm in the motorsports industry, specializing in advertising and merchandising. You may also remember them for being behind the Monsters of Destruction series in the mid-2000s, and Milestone would promote their own non-MOD shows in the early 2000s. Understandably, this would be very appealing to many independent monster truck teams looking to get the names of their trucks out there and further capitalize on their image and likeness. Milestone was responsible for the Muscle Machines toys, helped secure the Universal Studios sponsorship, as well as plenty of other recognizable monster truck toys from the era. Milestone made a point of going after some of the biggest independent names, and they acquired a good amount of them. You can assume that Milestone was quicker to signing independent trucks than Monster Jam was, due to them having a stronger roster on paper. However, this seems to be where the smoking gun lies for how these teams' futures would play out. In the year 2000, Paul Shafer had 12 trucks competing under his names during the USHRA winter season. To put this into perspective, there were 5 different Monster Patrols, 4 Barefoots, and 3 Carolina Crushers competing. Meanwhile, there were only 4 Gravediggers. This was also equally as many different trucks as Monster Jam had running names that they owned during the same year, both being 12. Despite this, none of Paul's trucks would make a single USHRA television appearance in the year 2000, aside from occasional cameos in commercials or background graphics, the latter being reused from 1999, or on a local news broadcast such as this one on Channel 9. For example, 3 of Paul's trucks, along with Samson, appear in the initial World Finals 1 commercial, despite none of them being invited to the event. In TruckWorld.com's Monster Monthly column from March of 2000, there was a section about how Paul Shafer was told directly by Monster Jam that none of his trucks were eligible for the World Finals in Las Vegas, despite being successful all year in both large and small events. Apparently the decision to also not include Paul's trucks on the Motor Madness television show was, quote, last minute. Despite this, no official reason was given in the post as to why this was the case. There was an attempted sale by Paul Shafer of his entire team of trucks and names to Monster Jam at around the same time, but this sale would fall through and there would be some conflict between the two parties afterwards, which may have influenced Monster Jam's decision. However, this does not explain the absence of other teams as well, namely Samson, Equalizer, and Executioner. Paul Shafer would give an interview on Scott Douglas' Twitch stream in January of 2022, following the sale of Paul Shafer Motorsports, in which he detailed his complicated relationship and falling out with Monster Jam, but made no mention of why his trucks were taken off of their television shows. Now, it's worth mentioning that Wild Thing was reportedly sold to Paul Shafer in 1999, according to 2 separate articles from Truck World and Monster Zone, yet some who are close to Tony Farrell's family have disputed this. For that reason, as well as the fact that Wild Thing was a part of Monster Jam's merchandising deals, I'm not including it when discussing Paul Shafer's fleet, since it was unaffected by the Milestone Motorsports deal, and was a part of Monster Jam's merchandising as late as 2006. In mid-1999, Brian Barthel would convert his Little Tiger truck into the second Purple and Orange Monster Patrol, in one of the best-known renditions of the truck. As a result, he would be absent from television for the entirety of the 2000 Monster Jam winter season, despite continuing to compete at high-profile events. When Brian brought back the Little Tiger truck in mid-2000 and returned to television later in the year, this was how Monster Jam announcer Scott Douglas explained his absence.
You know, we didn't see him, I don't think at all during the 2000 season. And it was a matter of going on some of the other USHRA circuits that are non-televised and working the bugs out. And boy, has he ever. Now, look at this.
While this is technically true, there's no reference to Monster Patrol, but rather that Brian was deliberately keeping a low profile in Little Tiger for the sake of fine-tuning the truck. After switching back to Little Tiger, Brian would end up driving the Wolverine truck for 3 years and was largely unaffected by the lack of TV coverage in 2000, even becoming a world champion in said truck before retiring in 2005 due to a back injury. Jeff Hoy is a retired tough truck driver, best known for driving the Monster Patrol tough truck for the better part of 2 decades. This truck made frequent appearances on Monster Jam's television show from 2000 to 2001, but despite this, was almost never referred to by name on TV, save for one pre-race graphic in 2001. When referring to the truck, the name Monster Patrol would only be said once by the commentators, and it would never appear on any of the brackets either, just simply stating Jeff's name.
Back on Monster Jam, we're ready for the Pro Stadium Truck Final. Mike Hogwood, Scott Douglas, Kate Milliken with you. It is Little Beast against Jeff Hoy's Ford F-150.
Jeff's wife, Angie Hoy, would run a red Barefoot tough truck as well, which would also not be referred to by name on Monster Jam's television show. In 1999, Monster Jam would begin ordering fully built monster trucks from Dan Patrick of Patrick Enterprises Incorporated to create their own fleet of trucks. This included Wrenchhead.com, Medusa, Sting, and what would become Spider-Man. Dan Patrick was also continuing to drive his Samson monster truck at a high level on the USHRA circuit. As mentioned before, Dan had also signed to Milestone Motorsports that same year, so in a cruel twist of irony, Dan was building all of Monster Jam's new fleet trucks, but was not featured on their own television shows in his own truck. It wouldn't make sense for Monster Jam to essentially punish somebody who's benefiting the company so much, so there would have to be another reason for this. David Morris in Equalizer was also someone who was still competing at a high level during this time, being a former world champion. Unfortunately for Morris, after signing to Milestone Motorsports, his last 2 seasons behind the wheel of Equalizer were non-televised, before selling the truck to Mike Hawkins in 2002. Hawkins also inherited the Milestone Motorsports deal, and although Hot Wheels would release an Equalizer monster truck toy in 2004, none of Hawkins' performances were televised on Monster Jam. Not to mention, having a mural on the top of his truck showing Tom Mentz's severed head may have rubbed Monster Jam the wrong way. Mark and Tim Hall of Hall Brothers Racing were one of the fiercest independent teams of the 1990s, and Executioner was a well-known name in the industry. The Hall Brothers took racing very seriously, and it showed. Much like the others, 1999 would be the last time the Hall Brothers would get major exposure on USHRA programming, before being removed from the TV lineups altogether, as none of the team's USHRA appearances from 2000 to 2002 would be broadcast on television or on any home releases. After Raminator debuted at a Monster Jam event in early 2002, the team was using Monster merchandise rather than Milestone, yet they would cease to compete at all USHRA events after the debut of said truck. A 2005 article about the Monsters of Destruction series listed the Hall Brothers as being a part of Milestone Motorsports, but this was most likely older, outdated information. Now, this does not mean that the relationship between Monster Jam and these teams was permanently damaged, or even in terms of merchandising. Samson was featured on the front of Monster Jam's 2000 tour shirt, yet without any of his other Milestone peers. If you look at the 2001 archive of the SFX online store, you can see Barefoot and Executioner t-shirts still for sale, 2 years after the Milestone deal went into effect. That being said, this is most likely extra unsold stock that Monster Jam was trying to clear out. These teams would all, for the most part, continue to appear at USHRA events for years afterwards, competing in both large and small venues, but with almost none of it being broadcast on television or featured on any home videos, with a few exceptions such as Gravedigger 20th Anniversary, Controlled Chaos, The History of Monster Trucks at the Pontiac Silverdome, and The True Life of Tom Mentz. Carolina Crusher will be mentioned by name at least twice during the 2001 TV season by announcer Mike Hogwood when referring to Gary Porter's driving history.
For Gary Porter out of Wadesboro, North Carolina, and Raging Steel. Big name in the monster truck circuit, former driver of Carolina Crusher. Gary Porter and Spider-Man out of Wadesboro, North Carolina, used to drive the Carolina Crusher.
Finally got a good donut going, and hey, it might not be in the Carolina Crusher, but I still like to do those donuts.
Seeing as this was more of a contextual fact rather than a promotion for the name, it most likely wouldn't have been an issue. The 2001 book, Monster Jam: The Amazing Guide, almost entirely omits any trucks related to Milestone Motorsports, aside from a few photos where they're shown in the background. It's also worth noting that not necessarily every team that was signed to Milestone Motorsports was suffering the same fate as the other trucks just mentioned. KCM and Obsession were signed to Milestone, despite the former appearing on the first Motor Madness show of the 2000 season, and both on Monster Jam's television shows during the early to mid-2000s for Around the USHRA segments. Perhaps the deals could have been signed at different times, but when it came to merchandising, KCM was with Monster Jam's Hot Wheels line, while Obsession was with Milestone Motorsports. Scott Hartsock's Obsession was featured frequently during the 2004 and 2005 TV series, but chances are Line-X had more of a say with what happened with the Obsession name than Milestone Motorsports did. Don Frankish's Maniac and Jurassic Attack were also part of Milestone, yet both trucks would have toys with Hot Wheels and would be shown on TV during the mid-2000s for the Around the USHRA segment. The same applies to Pat Gerber's Shocker monster truck, albeit with fewer TV appearances. Frankish's Jurassic Attack would become a favorite of Monster Jam in the mid to late 2000s, being featured on multiple pieces of merchandising, and with the body even being borrowed for a European tour in 2007 with Frankish behind the wheel. With all these teams competing primarily at West Coast events, they are far less likely to be featured on television to begin with, save for a few exceptions. Yet they were featured on TV multiple times throughout the mid-2000s while still being associated with Milestone Motorsports. D.L. Wilson's Virginia Giant was also signed to Milestone, but had its own Hot Wheels toys with Monster Jam as well. Since Wilson mostly competed on the Thunder National circuit, he wouldn't have been shown on Monster Jam TV often to begin with. 2 Extreme Racing also has ties to Milestone Motorsports, but would be a part of Monster Jam's merchandising and would be a staple in their TV series during the 2000s and 2010s, ultimately becoming one of the most successful independent monster truck teams of all time. That being said, references to the team would appear on Milestone's website well into the 2000s, and both trucks would perform at least one Milestone event in the year 2000, being in Las Vegas 1 week before World Finals 1. This may have been the extent of their involvement with the company, however, as further information is difficult to find. It's worth noting that Bounty Hunter's freestyle from the televised 2000 Pontiac show would be mysteriously cut from the broadcast, which aired after the World Finals took place, despite scoring a 28 and having a score shown in the final list. It's unknown why this occurred. While Monster Jam's television roster had shrunken in terms of star power, this gave other, lesser-known, non-Milestone teams the chance to shine in their place. By 1999, Jim Koehler was a plucky independent out of Columbus, Michigan, doing his best at trying to hang with the big dog, so to speak, with his eye-catching Avenger monster truck. He had a good truck that him and his dad had built, albeit with some bugs in it, and had been featured on television a handful of times at this point, but was not a threat to most of the 1999 roster. However, in 2000, Jim would be elevated significantly. Jim's New Orleans crash was Monster Jam royalty, and one of the most memorable crashes of the era. Albeit not on purpose, it made Jim Koehler someone to pay attention to, because you knew something interesting would happen. 2001 was even bigger, as not only would Koehler be featured on a majority of the televised events from that year and earn his nickname of Mr. Excitement, but his performance at the World Finals that year would make him into a star. This was the first time a monster truck had smashed through the side of a lone mobile home on television or pay-per-view, so it was a brand new spectacle for most fans. From this point forward, Jim Koehler was one of the top entertainers and personalities on the Monster Jam circuit, further solidifying that with the debut of the 57 Chevy body the following year and his Freestyle World Championship victory the year after that, being the first independent to do so. To this day, with multiple trucks to his team and multiple well-known identities such as Brutus and Wrecking Crew, Koehler is one of the top independent teams in the United States and has been for well over a decade, with even more world championships to his name now. Despite this, think about how small of a fish Jim was in the large pond of the 1999 World Finals, with trucks like Carolina Crusher, Barefoot, Samson, and Executioner. Avenger would have had very little room to shine with them around, and none of his star-making performances would have taken place, at least with very little likelihood. By 1999, John Seasock was also a plucky independent out of Frackville, Pennsylvania, running the humble yet slowly becoming outdated Sudden Impact truck. John's battle with Bell's palsy in 1998 made him a very sympathetic figure in the eyes of the fans, and was something that could have easily ended his career. Despite this, John made a recovery and was a decent competitor, running in numerous USHRA events throughout the 1990s and was featured on TV multiple times. This would all change when John would purchase Bob Fisher's Liquidator 2 truck during the summer of 1999, as Bob was retiring from the sport. John's transition into this truck would prove to be immediately fruitful, as with a more advanced truck, John could compete at a higher level. Soon afterwards, John would receive heavy promotion and praise on Monster Jam's television show, being talked about as one of the biggest prospects in the industry at that time, also earning a major victory over Tom Meents in 2001. John was Monster Jam's underdog, always consistent and always featured prominently as someone who you could root for, not to mention someone they could trust, which led to him driving the Batman truck in 2007. That year, John would win the racing championship in one of the feel-good victories of all time. Not to mention, he would go on to do it a second time the following year in 2008. Much like with Jim Koehler, imagine this version of Sudden Impact running with Equalizer, Samson, or Carolina Crusher on Monster Jam. John would have definitely done well for himself, and competing against those trucks in the early 2000s he definitely did, but it's unlikely that he would have reached the same heights or received as much exposure with those other well-established names also in the fray with him. Another success story that came as a result of this shift in focus was Dan Evans in Destroyer. Like Jim Koehler, Dan and his wife/crew chief Lori were also Michigan natives who were very new to monster trucks in the year 1999. After many exciting freestyle performances on TV during the 2000 and 2002 seasons, Dan was someone to look out for on the USHRA circuit, specifically for his freestyles. While usually not victorious on TV, he became best known in the 2000s for his wheelies and his signature reverse move, similar to Mike Vaughters of Black Stallion fame. Dan kept getting good exposure on Monster Jam with 6 World Finals invites, eventually moving into a brand new Destroyer truck in 2008 that he would also do well in before selling the team in 2012. However, this wasn't before Monster Jam would hire Dan to drive the brand new Hot Wheels Firestorm truck for the entirety of 2012, and he continued working for Monster Jam as a backup and international driver well into the late 2010s. Dan definitely made a strong impression on Monster Jam during the early 2000s, but one could wonder if he would have been given the same platform to prove himself just like Jim Koehler and just like John Seasock. The same applies to trucks like Bustin' Loose, Reptoid, Eradicator, Predator, Airborne Ranger, and Thrasher, among others. While these trucks all had varying degrees of success, their exposure on both Monster Jam's TV show and merchandising undoubtedly did wonders for them in terms of fan acknowledgement and notoriety. Alan Pizzo's Predator was already a well-known and easily recognizable truck during this era, with that one having a reputation of being a wild freestyler who often made the highlight reels, so the added exposure, as well as his trucks being all over Monster Jam's merchandising and promo materials, helped Alan out quite a bit, as well as his team truck, Prowler. Alan would make it to the Monster Jam World Finals a total of 4 times, and still drives Predator to this day. Andy Slifko's Eradicator was a team truck to John Seasock's Sudden Impact, and got lots of TV exposure in the 2000s. Slifko was much like Dan Evans in that he was a gutsy freestyler and often put on a memorable performance. His son Jeremy would end up being even more successful in Backdraft, making it to the 2011 World Finals. Ron Nelson was just a humble independent from Conroe, Texas with his eye-catching Bustin' Loose truck, which was admittedly underpowered and often outperformed by the competition. But after a memorable crash during the freestyle segment of the 1999 World Finals, this clip of Bustin' Loose was in almost every USHRA highlight reel at that time. For the next 2 seasons, Ron would get lots of TV time on Monster Jam, often being an underdog that the fans could root for, even if his chances of victory were highly unlikely. After the 2002 season, Monster Jam would hire Ron to drive the company's second high roller monster truck, which he did for the first quarter of 2003. After a very destructive first quarter, Ron will return to driving his old Bustin' Loose monster truck, which he still drives to this day. Joe Cypher has one of the most remarkable stories in monster trucks, being not only a veteran, but the only full-time monster truck driver who is paralyzed from the waist down, using only hand controls inside his truck. Airborne Ranger got very little TV time before the 2000 season, but would be featured often during the 2000 and 2001 seasons, with his freestyle performances often being a highlight on television. Joe had already been in monster trucks for a few years by 2000, but gained much needed exposure through Monster Jam's programming and merchandising, making him into a monster truck folk hero who still competes in Airborne Ranger to this day. Jim and Linda Jack's Reptoid was one of the most recognizable independent trucks on the USHRA roster, partly because of its unique design, but also because of how often it was featured on Monster Jam's television show and their toy and merchandising line. Known as more of a racer than a freestyler, Jim's driving style was often conservative, but he is perhaps best known for being a major racing threat in his home state of Florida, beating the likes of Gravedigger and Maximum Destruction, as well as having many battles against Dennis Anderson and Gravedigger. Reptoid was already relatively well known at the time, having been featured on Monster Jam numerous times throughout the previous years, but the void left in the TV lineups gave Jim Jack a much greater chance to prove himself as a racer, and during that time, he did. As stated earlier, while a large portion of Monster Jam's bigger independent names were no longer on TV or merchandising, this absence left excess room for other independent teams to shine in their place, with almost all of them becoming bigger and better as a result, or at least fondly remembered. Some became big stars at the time, some became big stars for years to come. Of course, as mentioned at the start of this video, It's not 100% confirmed that the Milestone Motorsports deals are the reason that all of these changes took place within Monster Jam. After searching through multiple Monster Truck news websites from the era and talking to some of the drivers from the era as well, few of them gave many specific reasons as to why certain trucks were removed from Monster Jam's TV shows and merchandising. Due to this most likely being an upper management issue, it would make sense that a good amount of the drivers and general industry staff of the time were not privy to why certain trucks were no longer being featured on television, or at least they were not at liberty to disclose said information. Even though the reason isn't 100% confirmed, it only makes sense that the contracts with Milestone Motorsports, whatever they may have entailed for certain teams and trucks, had something to do with why these certain superstar trucks weren't being shown on Monster Jam's television shows anymore, as well as merchandising and certain promo materials. Most likely being a contractual conflict between Monster Jam and Milestone regarding certain trucks, which was obviously not sorted out by the year 2000. Or it could have been a simple decision by Monster Jam to not promote Milestone trucks, perhaps seeing them as a competitor, and definitely the big name trucks they would have wanted on their merchandising instead. Meanwhile, almost none of the trucks that were shown immediately post 1999 had anything to do with Milestone Motorsports. As a result, a good chunk of Monster Jam's fans who are under 30 don't have the same levels of reverence or attachment to these excluded trucks as much as older fans who grew up with them or saw them frequently in person do, despite never truly leaving the circuit, mainly the trucks that Paul Shafer owned. Since Monster Jam's programming and World Finals essentially started a new timeline in the year 2000, that's where the buck stops for many younger fans. Nothing before that season is featured on Monster Jam's YouTube membership as well. Thankfully, with the luxury of YouTube, almost all of the older USHRA programming is still available to watch for free, as well as the Pen to Point series and USA Motorsports' Motor Madness, all three of which would feature these trucks frequently during the 1990s. This is how many younger fans would discover these trucks in the 21st century, outside of Monster Jam. It's also necessary to mention that, despite the lack of exposure on Monster Jam, many of the excluded trucks were not hurt in the long run. Back in 2000, there were still plenty of other circuits to run on, and there was still an open window for a monster truck promoter to get a TV deal and become a popular competitor to Monster Jam, despite it ultimately never happening. Teams like the Hall brothers, which included Raminator and Rammunition, Samson, and Equalizer, which also included Hot Tamale, would continue to compete at a high level throughout the 2000s without needing to be in Monster Jam to do it. Most would return to Monster Jam's television show by the beginning of the 2010s. Despite these three teams having great success and most of Milestone's roster still being around to this day, the story of Paul Shafer Motorsports is a bit more complicated than that. Paul Shafer would go on to run his own smaller shows during the 2000s and largely avoided the more high-profile, high-intensity racing leagues. Paul wasn't making enough of a profit when running for Monster Jam, as well as getting no TV exposure, so he mostly ran his own shows on his own terms for much of the decade. Unfortunately, the team's scale and competitive nature would shrink significantly by the end of the 2000s, despite having been the largest independent team of all time at one point. Monster Jam would even attempt to buy Paul Shafer Motorsports around a decade ago, but without any success. That opportunity would go to James Trantina of Triple B Motorsports in January of 2022. And despite everything that had gone on in the past, Monster Jam actually leased the Carolina Crusher name from Paul Shafer in 2014 for the final leg of Gary Porter's driving career, and even having a Hot Wheels toy to go along with it. As for Milestone Motorsports, unfortunately they would go out of business after the Monsters of Destruction series aired in the mid-2000s, with its 2 seasons being what they're best remembered for. They also briefly went bankrupt in mid-2001, but would return not long afterwards. All of Monsters of Destruction can be found for free on YouTube. Most importantly, this video isn't meant to pin the blame on one party or another. For the most part, everything would work out in the end for any teams that were affected, with much of Milestone's roster not appearing on Monster Jam TV simply due to being on the West Coast circuit or choosing to compete elsewhere. Those who gained additional exposure in their place would all benefit from it in one way or another. Regardless of the exact reasons why, this major shift in Monster Jam's merchandising and televised roster, with them being the biggest and most recognizable monster truck promoter of all time and to date, undoubtedly changed the course of history for the company as well as the sport of monster truck racing itself.